The gunshot echoed through the canyon like thunder splitting the desert sky, and I threw myself behind the nearest boulder as the bullet splintered the rock face inches from my head, sending shards of red sandstone cascading down onto my already torn and bloodied clothes. My name is Ezra Hawkins, I am 17 years old, and until 3 days ago I had never seen a man die, but now as I crouched in the merciless Arizona heat with my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged animal, I could still see the face of the stranger who had put a bullet through my guardian's chest before disappearing into the wilderness with everything we owned, leaving me alone in this godforsaken territory with nothing but the clothes on my back and a burning rage that seemed to consume me from the inside out. Old Pete Garrison had found me as a baby on the steps of a church in Tucson, a squalling infant wrapped in nothing but a flour sack with a note pinned to my chest that simply read, "His name is Ezra and he deserves better than what I can give him," and for 17 years Pete had been the closest thing to family I had ever known, teaching me to read and write by the light of our campfires, showing me how to track game through the desert, and filling my head with stories of gold hidden somewhere in these endless canyons by Spanish conquistadors who had died before they could return to claim their treasure. Pete had been a prospector, a dreamer, and probably half crazy from too many years under the desert sun, but he had also been kind to a foundling child who had no one else in the world, and watching him bleed out in the dirt while his killer rode away with our mules, our supplies, and the crude map Pete had spent 15 years creating had awakened something dark and vengeful in my soul that I had never known existed. The second shot came from a different angle, confirming my worst fears that there were at least 2 of them hunting me through these twisting arroyos and hidden valleys, men who had obviously followed us from the last trading post where Pete had made the mistake of showing that damned map to the wrong person after too many whiskeys had loosened his tongue. I had been gathering firewood when they struck, and the sound of Pete's scream had brought me running back to our camp just in time to see a tall man in a black hat putting his smoking pistol back in its holster while his partner rifled through our meager possessions, tossing aside everything that was not immediately valuable and loading our pack animals with the efficiency of men who had done this kind of work before. The rage that had sustained me through 3 days of pursuit was beginning to give way to something much worse, the cold realization that I was outgunned, outnumbered, and running out of both water and ammunition in country that could kill a man in a dozen different ways even without human predators stalking him through the maze of red rock canyons and hidden arroyos that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. My lips were cracked and bleeding from thirst, my boots were falling apart from walking over sharp rocks and thorny desert plants, and the sun overhead felt like the hammer of some vengeful god determined to beat me into the ground until I surrendered what little remained of my stubborn will to survive. But it was while I was pressed against that boulder, listening to the sound of my own ragged breathing and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead, that I heard something else entirely, a sound so unexpected and out of place that for a moment I thought the heat and exhaustion might be causing me to hallucinate. From somewhere deeper in the canyon, echoing off the ancient stone walls with a clarity that seemed almost supernatural, came the terrified crying of a child, high and desperate and filled with the kind of primal fear that cuts straight through to a man's soul regardless of his own circumstances or the dangers he might be facing. The sound pulled at something deep inside me, some instinct or memory that had nothing to do with my current predicament and everything to do with the way old Pete had found me all those years ago, alone and helpless and depending on the mercy of strangers for my very survival. Against every rational thought screaming in my head about the folly of revealing my position to armed men who wanted me dead, I found myself moving toward the source of that crying, keeping low and using the scattered boulders and desert vegetation for cover, driven by something stronger than fear or even common sense. What I found when I rounded a bend in the canyon wall made me forget entirely about the men hunting me, at least for the moment, because there, balanced precariously on a narrow ledge about 20 feet down the side of a sheer drop that opened into a maze of jagged rocks and thorny cacti, was a small Apache boy who could not have been more than 6 or 7 years old. His dark hair was decorated with small feathers and beads in the traditional manner, his clothing was the simple breechcloth and moccasins of his people, and his large brown eyes were wide with terror as he clung to the crumbling sandstone with fingers that were clearly losing their strength with each passing moment. The sight of him hit me like a physical blow, not just because of his obvious peril but because of what his presence here meant about the larger forces at work in this disputed territory where Apache bands still roamed free despite the Army's ongoing efforts to force them onto reservations, and where the discovery of a lost Apache child by white men could mean the difference between peaceful coexistence and bloody warfare depending on the circumstances and the men involved. If my pursuers found this boy, if they decided he might be valuable as a hostage or simply chose to eliminate a potential witness to their crimes, the consequences could extend far beyond my own personal tragedy to encompass entire communities of innocent people. But even as these thoughts raced through my mind, the practical reality of the situation demanded immediate action, because the child's grip was failing and within minutes he would fall to his death unless someone acted quickly and decisively. The ledge where he had somehow become trapped was too far down and too narrow for him to climb back up on his own. The walls of the canyon were steep and treacherous with loose rock that crumbled at the slightest touch, and I could see from his positioning that he had probably been trying to retrieve something, perhaps a toy or a pet, when he had slipped and found himself in this deadly predicament. Without conscious thought or planning, I began searching the immediate area for anything that might serve as a rope or climbing aid, but the desert around me offered nothing but scattered rocks, thorny vegetation, and the occasional stunted juniper tree whose branches were too weak and brittle to support a man's weight. The realization that I would have to attempt the rescue with nothing but my own strength and determination sent a chill through me despite the blazing heat, because I knew that one mistake, one moment of poor judgment or bad luck, would send both of us plummeting to our deaths on the rocks below. The sound of approaching horses and shouting voices told me that my pursuers were getting closer, their search pattern gradually tightening around my location with the methodical persistence of men who had done this kind of hunting before, and I knew that I had perhaps minutes before they would round the bend and discover both me and the trapped child. The thought of what they might do if they found us together, two vulnerable targets instead of one, made my decision for me, and I began my descent into the canyon without allowing myself time to consider all the ways this desperate gamble might end in disaster. The first few feet were the hardest, finding handholds in rock that had been weathered smooth by centuries of wind and water, testing each grip before committing my full weight to it while loose stones scattered away beneath my boots and rattled down into the depths below. The Apache child watched my progress with eyes that seemed to hold far more understanding and intelligence than should have been possible for someone so young, and I found myself talking to him in low, reassuring tones even though I was fairly certain he could not understand English and I knew no words of his native tongue. As I worked my way closer to the ledge where he waited, fighting against the pull of gravity and the crumbling nature of the ancient sandstone, I became aware of other sounds echoing through the canyon, sounds that made my blood run cold because they suggested that the situation had become far more complicated than a simple rescue of a lost child. From somewhere above and behind me came the unmistakable sound of unshod horses moving at speed across rocky ground, accompanied by voices speaking in what I was almost certain was Apache, their tone urgent and filled with what could only be described as barely controlled rage. The implications of this development struck me like a physical blow as I realized that the child's family or tribal band had obviously discovered his absence and were now searching for him with the kind of intensity that spoke of desperate fear for his safety, and that my own presence here, a white stranger in a land where tensions between Apache and settlers had been escalating for months, could easily be misinterpreted as something far more sinister than a rescue attempt. If they found me here with their child, if they arrived at the scene without understanding what had actually happened, the results could be catastrophic for everyone involved. But the boy's weakening grip and the sound of approaching danger from multiple directions left me no choice but to continue my descent, moving as quickly as I dared while trying to calculate whether I could reach him and get both of us to safety before either the Apache warriors or my original pursuers arrived to complicate an already impossible situation. The irony was not lost on me that I might die today trying to save the life of a child whose people would consider me their enemy, or that my death might spark exactly the kind of violence and misunderstanding that would bring suffering to countless innocent people on both sides of a conflict I had never wanted any part of. When I finally reached the ledge where the boy waited, his small body trembling with exhaustion and fear, I was struck by the trust one saw in his dark eyes as I wrapped my arms around him and began the even more treacherous journey back up the canyon wall, carrying his slight weight while maintaining my own precarious grip on rock that seemed determined to crumble away at the worst possible moments. The child pressed his face against my shoulder and held on with the desperate strength that only comes from absolute terror, and I found myself thinking about old Pete and the way he had risked everything to save a foundling baby 17 years ago, wondering if this was how such acts of mercy always felt, like stepping off a cliff and trusting that somehow the ground would rise up to meet you. The voices above were getting closer now, both the harsh English curses of my pursuers and the fluid Apache words that seemed to flow like water over stone, and I knew that within moments this canyon would become a battlefield where a poor orphan boy and a lost Apache child would find themselves caught between forces far larger and more dangerous than anything either of them had ever imagined. The moment my boots touched solid ground at the top of the canyon with the Apache child still clinging to my chest like his life depended on it, which in all likelihood it did, I found myself staring down the barrels of 3 different guns held by men whose faces told stories of violence and greed that made my stomach turn over with a sick understanding of just how badly this situation had deteriorated in the span of a few desperate minutes. The 2 men who had killed old Pete stood about 20 yards away, their weapons trained on me with the casual confidence of predators who had cornered their prey, while behind them, barely visible in the shadows between 2 massive boulder formations, I could make out the silhouettes of what appeared to be at least 4 Apache warriors on horseback, their own weapons drawn but their attention focused not on me but on the armed white men who had clearly arrived at this sacred place with intentions that had nothing to do with rescue or mercy. The tall man in the black hat, the one whose face I had burned into my memory during 3 days of pursuit through this hellish landscape, smiled with the kind of cold satisfaction that told me he believed this confrontation would end exactly as he had planned, with my death and the recovery of whatever information about Pete's treasure map he thought I might possess. But there was something in his expression that seemed different now, a kind of predatory excitement that had nothing to do with gold or revenge and everything to do with the small Apache child I held in my arms, and I realized with growing horror that he saw the boy not as a complication to be avoided but as an opportunity to be exploited in ways that made my blood run cold. Well, he drawled in a voice like gravel sliding down a hillside, his gun never wavering from its target as he took a step closer, his boots crunching on the scattered stones that covered the canyon floor. Looks like our young friend here has managed to find himself something even more valuable than that old fool's treasure map, something that certain folks might be willing to pay handsomely to get back in one piece, if you catch my meaning. His companion, a shorter man with scars covering half his face and the kind of eyes that suggested he had long ago stopped seeing other people as anything more than obstacles to be removed or tools to be used, nodded in agreement while keeping his own weapon pointed directly at my head. The Apache child in my arms had gone completely still the moment he saw the guns, his small body pressed against mine with the absolute trust that only comes from having been saved from certain death, and I could feel his heart beating against my chest like the wings of a trapped bird as he sensed the danger that surrounded us without fully understanding the complex web of greed, prejudice, and violence that had brought us all together in this remote canyon where the desert wind carried the scent of sage and creosote and the promise of sudden, brutal death. His dark eyes, so bright and intelligent despite his obvious exhaustion and fear, moved back and forth between the white men with their drawn guns and the shadows where his own people waited with the patience of hunters who understood that the right moment for action would reveal itself soon enough. But it was the sound that came from those shadows that changed everything, a low whistle that seemed to blend seamlessly with the natural sounds of the desert until I realized it was actually a signal, a form of communication that spoke of coordination and planning and a level of tactical sophistication that these 2 killers had clearly not anticipated when they followed me into what they had assumed was empty wilderness. The scarred man's head jerked toward the source of the sound, his confident expression beginning to show the first traces of uncertainty as he apparently began to understand that this situation was far more complex and dangerous than a simple matter of cornering a lone teenager in the middle of nowhere. Apache, the tall man said, and for the first time since I had begun tracking him through the desert, I heard something in his voice that might have been actual fear, though he tried to disguise it with a laugh that sounded forced and hollow in the thin air of the canyon. Well, that does complicate things a bit, doesn't it? He glanced at his partner, some unspoken communication passing between them before he turned his attention back to me, his gun still steady but his eyes now constantly moving as he tried to assess threats he could not see but clearly knew were there. The child in my arms chose that moment to speak, his voice high and clear as he called out in Apache, words that flowed like music despite the fear that still trembled underneath his brave attempt to communicate with his people. I could not understand what he was saying, but the tone was unmistakable, the sound of a child telling his family that he was safe, that he had been helped rather than harmed, and that the white boy who held him was not his enemy but his rescuer. The effect of his words on the hidden warriors was immediate and electric, a shift in the very atmosphere of the canyon that spoke of a fundamental change in the tactical situation that was about to unfold. What happened next unfolded with the kind of swift, coordinated precision that spoke of men who had been fighting together for years, who understood each other's movements and intentions without the need for words or signals, and who had honed their skills in countless battles against enemies who underestimated their intelligence and their tactical sophistication. The Apache warriors emerged from concealment like shadows coming to life, their horses moving with the fluid grace of creatures perfectly adapted to this harsh landscape, their weapons held with the casual competence of men who had never known defeat in their own territory. The leader of the group, a man who appeared to be in his 40s with the kind of weathered dignity that spoke of leadership earned through wisdom and courage rather than simply inherited through birth, rode directly toward us with his rifle held across his saddle, his dark eyes taking in every detail of the scene before him with the kind of comprehensive awareness that missed nothing and revealed even less. He was dressed in traditional Apache clothing decorated with intricate beadwork that caught the desert sunlight and seemed to tell stories of battles fought and victories won, and when he looked at me holding his child, I saw something in his expression that I could not immediately identify, something that seemed to go far deeper than simple gratitude for a rescue. The two killers, suddenly finding themselves surrounded by mounted warriors whose reputation for swift and merciless justice was legendary throughout the territory, began to show the first signs of the panic that comes when predators realize they have become prey, their guns swinging wildly between targets as they tried to calculate odds that were clearly not in their favor. The tall man in the black hat was sweating now despite the dry heat, his confident demeanor cracking like poorly fired pottery as he began to understand that his assumptions about this encounter had been catastrophically wrong from the very beginning. "Now hold on there," he called out, his voice pitched higher than before as he tried to project an authority he clearly no longer felt. "We don't want any trouble with you folks, we're just here chasing this boy who stole something from us, nothing that concerns you or your people." It was a lie so transparent and desperate that it might have been amusing under different circumstances, but the Apache leader's expression remained unchanged, his attention focused entirely on his child and the young white man who had risked his own life to save him. The boy in my arms spoke again, this time at greater length, his words tumbling over each other in his eagerness to tell his story, and I watched as the leader's face transformed with understanding and something that looked remarkably like respect as he listened to his child's account of the rescue. When the boy finished speaking, the leader dismounted with fluid grace and approached us slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening, his eyes never leaving my face as he studied me with the kind of intense scrutiny that seemed to see straight through to my soul. He spoke then in English that was precise and formal, each word carefully chosen and delivered with the kind of quiet dignity that commanded attention without demanding it. "My grandson tells me that you climbed down into the canyon to save his life when you could have passed by without stopping, when you had nothing to gain and much to lose by involving yourself in his danger." His voice carried the weight of absolute authority, the kind of natural leadership that had nothing to do with titles or positions and everything to do with the respect earned through a lifetime of making difficult decisions and living with their consequences. I found my voice somehow, though my throat was dry as desert sand and my hands were shaking with exhaustion and nervous energy as I tried to respond appropriately to what felt like the most important conversation of my life. "He was going to fall, sir, and I couldn't just walk away from that, not when there was something I could do to help him." The words sounded inadequate even to my own ears, a pale reflection of the complex emotions and desperate circumstances that had driven me to risk everything for a child I had never seen before and might never see again. The Apache leader nodded slowly, as if my response had confirmed something he had already suspected, and then he did something that changed the entire nature of this encounter in ways I could never have anticipated. He reached out and gently took his grandson from my arms, holding the boy close while continuing to regard me with that same intense, evaluating stare, and then he spoke again in words that seemed to carry the weight of ancient tradition and unbreakable obligation. "In our way, when someone saves the life of a child, especially one as precious as this grandson who is all that remains of my daughter who died bringing him into the world, a debt is created that cannot be repaid with simple words or small gifts that hold no real meaning." He paused, his eyes moving to the two armed men who stood frozen in place, clearly uncertain whether to flee or fight but unwilling to make any sudden movements that might trigger a response from the surrounding warriors. "Such a debt requires acknowledgement that goes far beyond the customs of your people, acknowledgement that creates bonds of kinship and obligation that last for generations." The implications of his words were beginning to sink in, though I was not sure I fully understood what he was offering or what it might mean for my future, when the tall man in the black hat made the kind of desperate, poorly calculated decision that men make when they realize their situation has deteriorated beyond any possibility of a favorable outcome. He raised his gun and fired, not at me or at the Apache leader, but directly at the child in his grandfather's arms, apparently believing that if he could not profit from this situation, he could at least ensure that no one else would either. The bullet never found its target because I threw myself forward without conscious thought, my body moving faster than my mind could process what was happening, and I felt the impact of the slug as it tore through the muscle of my shoulder and sent me spinning to the ground in an explosion of pain and blood that left me gasping and disoriented. The Apache response was immediate and final, their arrows finding their targets with the precision that comes from a lifetime of hunting in country where a missed shot means starvation, and within seconds both killers lay still in the dust of the canyon floor, their weapons scattered and their schemes ended forever. But as darkness began to close in around the edges of my vision and I felt strong hands lifting me from the ground, I heard the Apache leader's voice speaking words that would echo in my dreams for years to come. "You have twice proven your worth, young warrior, first by risking your life to save my grandson, and now by risking it again to protect him from harm. Such courage creates obligations that my people do not take lightly, obligations that will change your life in ways you cannot yet imagine." When I woke the next morning, I was lying on soft blankets inside a traditional Apache wickiup, my shoulder bandaged with herbs that dulled the pain and promoted healing, surrounded by the sounds and smells of a community going about its daily business with the kind of purposeful activity that spoke of people who understood their place in the world and their responsibilities to each other. Outside I could hear children playing, women talking as they worked, and men discussing matters of importance to the survival and welfare of the group, all of it conducted in the flowing musical language that I was already beginning to recognize and appreciate even though I understood none of the words. The Apache leader, whose name I learned was Nailnish, which meant something like, "he who works with the wind," came to speak with me as I recovered, explaining through careful English and patient repetition that their tribal council had met through the night to discuss my situation and had reached a decision that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. They were offering me something that no white man in the territory had ever been given, something that went far beyond simple hospitality or temporary protection, something that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of my life in ways that old Pete's treasure maps and gold fever dreams never could have accomplished. They were offering me a place among them, not as a guest or an outsider to be tolerated, but as a member of their community with all the rights and responsibilities that such membership entailed, including instruction in their language, their customs, their methods of survival in this harsh but beautiful country, and most importantly, their code of honor that valued courage, loyalty, and service to others above personal gain or individual advancement. It was an opportunity that represented everything I had never known I wanted, a chance to belong somewhere, to be part of something larger than myself, to find purpose and meaning in a life that had been shaped by loss and abandonment since the day I was born. As I lay there in that wickiup, listening to the sounds of a community that had opened its arms to welcome a stranger, I realized that sometimes salvation comes not in the form we expect but in the form we need, and that the Apache child I had saved from the canyon had ultimately saved me in return, leading me to a destiny I never could have imagined during all those lonely years of wandering through the desert with old Pete, searching for gold that might never have existed while missing. Entirely the real treasure that had been waiting for me in the form of people who understood that true wealth lies not in what we can take from the world, but in what we can give to each other.